Welcome, everyone. I'm very pleased today to be introducing Joana, who I've known for a long time. She's a climate activist, a researcher, academic. She's contributed to the AA and our neighbors down the road, UCL, for more than 20 years. She's a distinguished person, and looking forward to her presentation today. And I'm very pleased to say she will end the presentation with an announcement of her new research in Brazil, which has just achieved full grant funding. So please welcome Joana.
Thank you, Mike. It's such an honor to address the school in this special week when we are all stopping to reflect and discuss and get to know more about climate matters. It's the second year we are doing this, and again, for me, it's a special moment because I have the opportunity also to share with you some of my work, some of my reflections. So the idea of the conversation today, when I put this title forward, Environmental Design for Climate Resilience in the Tropics for Vulnerable Communities, it's not a lecture, it's more of a talk. The idea here is not teach anything, it's to propose, to discuss first concepts that will help us to improve our awareness of the challenge. We're also going to talk about a general, what I would call a very general design approach to this challenge. And in doing this, I will also propose, discuss, show what I have found out by doing both empirical work, analytical work, and design work. What works? What works in the tropics? How should we be designing the tropics? So that's the world. It's quite a diverse climatic condition. If we see the Köppen climate classification is the official, very, well considered and applied broadly when we want to understand in detail which are the climatic conditions we are dealing with, depending on where we are designing for in the world. And it's super important to keep this in mind, that also when we talk about the tropics, it's not just one big zone of warm temperatures and rain. How hot does it get? The solar angles change. How much rain do we get? It does vary even within the tropics. So this variety, it's very important to be contemplated in design if we are to stop making gestures and doing effective design proposals. So this is just to emphasize what the topic is about. In this lecture, I will approach the design challenges of this region, which stays between the Tropic of Capricorn and the Tropic of Cancer. And it does vary from a very warm and humid zone, where we see the darkest blue, to a variation of warm climate with some quite dry seasons as well. So some facts. Why the tropics? It is the home to some of the world's most undeveloped regions and those most affected by climate change. And all these facts just add up to the fact that we should all be paying attention to the tropics if we want to make a difference in the world when it comes to climate change. When it comes to climate, even before climate change, the tropic accounts for 40% of the world's total surface area and are the host of approximately 80% of the world's biodiversity. In addition to that, we know, I think we all here know a little bit about it, that it is the concentration of poverty and vulnerable communities. Vernacular architecture design in the tropics by the tropical people have beautiful, incredible lessons that we always look back when we want to design something in response to these conditions. And they do know very wisely how to create not just comfortable I would like to put this word in question, but healthy and pleasant conditions, and also create opportunities for social and cultural activities. But the challenge of the tropicals today is another one. Of course, the vulnerable communities of the forests are still there and have to be looked after. But we have, in parallel to that, a problem that is quite unique for this century. The favelas, as Brazilians called, the shanty towns, the slums. This is one of the biggest favelas in Brazil, is in Rio, Favela da Rocinha, we called, with 200,000 people living in it. And this all happened in the last 50 years. So it's a reasonably new problem for architecture. That's before modernism did all this beautiful and, I would say, even to a big extent, responsive buildings that we will see. But how does it feel? What is Rio like when it comes to climate? It's something that humidity is almost constantly above 80%. Temperatures in the summer easily above 27, between 27 and 35 degrees. The maximum can easily peak over 40. Global radiation of more than 800 watts per square meter on the horizontal surface. That's quite a lot of energy. But it's a place that when we are in the shade and exposed to wind, you can really enjoy the tropical condition. When we go to another part of the world, now we're in Mumbai, the slum of Dharavi. Many of you know that. We have many students in the A that come from India. You are all very welcome. It's wonderful to work with you. And this is a problem, 1 million people living in a slum. So almost the glamour of the vernacular architecture, the glorious space of vernacular architecture, how do we apply the lessons when we have this context to deal with? This slum, by the way, was founded over 100 years ago, and it's a different issue than in Latin America, where the phenomena is more recent. Now, just a bit of context. The United Nations put this challenge to us. By 2030, they want an agenda. They have an agenda for sustainable development. And it's very clear that we're not going to meet if we don't, if we don't just look at the reality of the tropics today and what is going on there. But the discussion about environmental design in the tropics is not new, again, and the problem of the slums is reasonably new in some parts of the world. But we've been thinking about that, and this very school, the AA, was the center of the world in discussing environmental design for the tropics in the 1950s, in the tropical school. Last year we had an exhibition here about the work of the Department of Tropical Studies that started in the 50s with two architects, British architects, Drew and Fry, Maxwell Fry and James Drew, who worked in India, worked in Africa, well, in Africa first, and then came to the AA to found the tropical school. And they had, a very local approach to the topic. They look at how people use buildings, how communities got together, and they try hard to understand the climate. There was a lot of physics and technical knowledge applied to that was beautifully summarized in sketches and buildings in the end that contemplated the sun, the humidity, the air movement, a lot about transitional spaces. There's one critique I have to that architecture, is the sheer amount of concrete that the tropical modernism took to Africa and to India. But it was part of a whole moment that architecture and progress was going through. In the lessons that we can take from their work, we see very lightweight envelopes, despite the concrete structure. Very well thought through and detailed apertures and systems for ventilation and shaded, all integrated in the building systems. These are some of the books that we have here in the library. I had a lot of fun, spent quite a lot of time going through them. and it's really beautiful. This knowledge was translated in a series of buildings, community buildings, residential, schools, including the Abodi Girls School, one of the first projects from Drew and Fry in Africa, in Ghana. Now, that synthesis that they did in architecture was backed up, and that's maybe my first strong point here, or message I would like to convey, was very strongly backed up by physics, technical knowledge. Building physics is important, and we need to understand the phenomena. We don't always need to get to the details of the calculation, but we need to understand the phenomena, what is going on between the environmental forces, the building systems, the spatial compositions, the proportions, and the climate. And that was the work of Königsberger, the second director of the Tropical School, who stayed for 2 decades leading the school here in the AA, and formed a generation of architects from Europe, from Africa, from India, that came, studied, and went back to practice. One of the seminal pieces by Königsberger was the roof in the warm, humid tropics, where him with a group of researchers studied more than 40 alternatives, looking at the possibility of materials, but also in very detailed, looking at the physics. And I love this, I photographed this page from the book when he says, if we want to standardize architecture in the tropics, and the cities will come and they will grow, and there will be a population explosion, and we will need to produce a lot. Although in Europe we are used to, or we started our standardization process by looking at structures and wall components, when it comes to the tropics, it's the roof that's going to define this architecture. And of course, that comes from a very well understanding of the climate. But not just the roof, but which roof? We're going to talk about this in a few minutes. But here is my second critique about the work of that generation. All this discussion about environmental design back then and now, it's based by a notion of comfort, of reasonable conditions that we are supposed to create in buildings. And although there was a look to the culture and to the way people used buildings in those contexts to design for them, there was also a very, and I would dare to say, a very westernized construct of what comfort is. And we're still doing that today. And for me, this is one of the biggest barriers in advancing with good environmental design in warm regions of the world. And here we see, when we look at this small gray area in the graph on the left, we see a combination of air temperatures and air movement defining what's supposed to be a comfort zone, and far too narrow. I mean, 27 degrees is not too hot for people who grow in the tropics. 70% humidity is definitely not a problem. So there was an underestimation of the role of air movement in creating pleasant and healthy conditions, and an overestimation of the impact of humidity. And again, I will repeat, we still do this today, but less. Decades later, we have what we call the adaptive comfort model. Those who study more environmental design are aware of that. That establishes a relationship between outside and inside temperatures. So depending on the average of the last week, a range will be acceptable in buildings, inside buildings, in a specific place. Now, if we take an average of the last month, this range will be slightly narrower. If I take an average of the last 3 months, it will be slightly narrow. The point is, we adapt. So the body has a memory of what is happening climate-wise, and has a memory of the last week, of the last month, and of the last 3 months. So comfort or health. When I say I'm uncomfortable in a certain condition, or assume that other people will be, and therefore I need to design systems, we are normally not considering that potential that adaptability gives. Now, the moment I apply that equation that I just showed in a climate, which is a bunch of data, let's look at São Paulo, right in the tropics. You see, in the summer, temperature varies between 19 and 34. The average maximum is actually 27 degrees, the average minimum around 19. The comfort zone is quite stable through the year because the climate doesn't change so much through the year. There is a variation, but it doesn't change so much. But there's still a wide range. And this range should be used for design. If we don't consider that range, if we want to reduce the entropy in buildings, there's no way we can do it with architecture unless we condition spaces. But we definitely don't need to. We don't need for health reasons, and we don't need for comfort reasons. If we consider now the effect of air movement, which has been studied in the last 20 years a lot, especially in warm, humid climates, we can have an increase or a decrease in perception of almost 4 degrees. Definitely 3 degrees with 1.5 meters per second, which is something acceptable indoors. Papers will fly, but who works with papers? And if we have papers, we can find ways of fixing papers. It doesn't need to be 1.5, it can be 1 or can be 0.8. The fact is we need to play with those variables. Now, this is so important. I'm sorry I have this written. I thought a lot, how could I show these two concepts in images? But I didn't figure out last night when I was tuning that. So I'm going to tell you. There is a lot of discussion, and it's one of the last images on comfort, and we start talking about design, but there's a lot of discussion now, very recent, that one of the reasons that we are so vulnerable to virus and all the sources of disease and why our immune system is so weak is because we live in a very narrow thermal conditions in buildings, conditioned spaces in buildings. It's killing our immunity. So the more we are exposed to colder and to warmer, healthier the body will be, more resilient we will be to temperature variations, but better our health will be. In addition to that, which is fantastic, we have researchers on thermal comfort telling us that the best of the thermal sensations, which is called alesthesia, is a change in sensorial perception of thermal conditions, happens in transitional spaces when we have variations between air temperature, surface temperature, air movement, and even exposure to solar radiation. So these are the people who were telling us a few decades ago that comfort was narrow, and then improved to the adaptive thermal model, and now are telling us that even the adaptive comfort model can be questioned, should be questioned. The good news is that, so we are talking about something that is not anymore a narrow zone. We are talking about thermal delight, sensorial experience, as a way of relating to spaces that always makes us healthier, and probably will invite even a better relationship with the climate as the climate becomes more challenging. So when I was in the lecture, when these guys were presenting these concepts, I raised my hand and I said, are you saying that we can think of a building that doesn't have static conditions or a very narrow fixed conditions, but actually transitions? And they said exactly that. And as we do that, instead of closing ourselves as climate becomes more challenging, we're going to open up. We're going to open to the challenges of climate change. We're going to open to hot temperatures by creating transitions and exploring these sensorial experiences that we can create. And the discussion about thermal delight and environmental diversity in architecture, it's not new in architecture as well. So we have the work of these great monsters, Lisa Heshong, 1979, and Koen Stimmers from Cambridge, talking about diversity and delight. So this is where we unlock things if we understand this potential. Now, let's talk a bit about design processes. Learning from existing built environment will show us examples of how those sensory experience, that anesthesia, that healthy condition can be found. The importance of building physics, which are the principles of environmental design, and the value of analytical studies that reduces uncertainties of the environmental conditions we are designing for. So a couple of examples of design research that I supervise with in the graduate school here in the AA. Just one finished now, which was for a labor camp in the capital of Kerala in India. We started by looking at the climate. Environmental design starts by looking very analytically at the climate. And then we look at existing conditions, looking also at the materials that are available to this kind of buildings and alternative solutions, better examples using natural materials. And then we did what Königsberger told us to do. Let's look at the roof. We are in a very low latitude and starts with a metal roof that can give an internal temperature of 40 degrees, far over heat stress. If we want to talk about health, anything above 35 degrees becomes heat stress, serious health issue. Whereas outside temperature is only 33 or 34. And as we increase thermal mass, not just shade, but even in the tropics, when temperatures are above any limit of health, let's go 34, 35, mass starts being an important strategy, a useful strategy. We can bring this down. And if we increase mass and insulation, using the metal roof which is there, we can bring this even lower. Playing with reflections, playing with shade, playing with mass, we can get inside, well inside the comfort zone, also working with walls, whereas the envelope now has more resistance to the high temperatures, and the openings will allow air movement when the temperatures are mild. So this is a series of analytical work that led us to this great result of temperatures below 30 degrees when outside it's almost 40. Now another exercise that we also did in the graduate school 2 years ago, it was a different one, was now looking at density. The solution that the Indian government gives in Mumbai to social housing is just appalling, to say the least. The images speak for themselves. When we look at the climate, we see it's actually not very challenging. This is easier than Kerala. This is easier than Rio. But we need to design well. We need to leave the sun out, but we want to bring daylight in. We see temperatures go average maximum just over 30 degrees, in the worst case, 34, that I can still keep the air moving at that level and provide healthy conditions. So we took a block, one of those blocks, designed for social housing that was never finalized and never occupied, and start cutting it. What is the minimum that we need to open up that shape to bring a bit of daylight in the lower floors and air movement through the open spaces, to then create pressure on the windows, that therefore leading to some kind of internal good natural ventilation. And that we need analytical work. We're not going to do that in the feeling. We need complex analytical work. We can have simple analytical work helping us studying the envelope, but we need complex analytical work to start looking at air moving between buildings. And then after doing this minimum cut, because we want density, but there is a price. So some of this density will have to go for us to create living conditions in those spaces which are already there, with a lot of carbon in its structure and envelope. Then we look inside the buildings. How can we improve daylight conditions? And again, by creating this connection with the outside, we managed to get something below 30 degrees at peak when outside is almost 34. Series of transitions created shaded spaces when the mean air temperature would be far less than the outside just because, although it's an open space, it's shaded and has some mass. And that's the visualization. That's what we are imagining, like Weinstock asked us to imagine on Monday. So we work with the numbers, we work with the climate, we work with the principles. We build on the potential of adaptation, adaptability of the occupant, and we imagine better spaces. Now let's go into the slum. Now a real-life project, something that started by a motivation comes from these numbers. Well, Brazil, first, sadly, is one of the countries in the world with the biggest social economic inequality. As a result of that, or as a symptom of that, 30% of the population in São Paulo lives in slums, 22% of the population in Rio lives in slums, and the prediction is that we have now over 25% of the country's population living in slums. Not different from what we saw in Mumbai. Climate a bit more mild. We are in São Paulo now, Paraisópolis. It's wonderful. It means the wonderful city, which is wonderful for these people. It's the hope to be inserted in the urban environment, to be near jobs, near healthcare and education one day. And that's why they come. São Paulo, Rio, Recife, the big cities in Brazil receive a lot of the country's population that are looking to escape from misery of the country and be inserted somehow in a kind of urban infrastructure. So Paraisópolis has 40,000 people living, more or less, nowadays, and is an example of a typical slum in Brazil or in Latin America. Consolidated one, made out of brick, often with very vulnerable, very lightweight metal roofs, windows that unfortunately are small and restricted to the size that they can buy. There's a big lobby of window frames in the country that managed to popularize a very small window with a very inefficient aperture for ventilation. We should be ashamed of ourselves of having allowed that. And then when we look at the climate, it's not really challenging. Temperatures just go above 30 degrees in a hot summer day. Winter is very mild. It's perfect, actually, 24 degrees if it's sunny. If it's an overcast day in the summer, temperatures stay around 20-something. We just open your window. You just want the inside to be like the outside. And that's a very important idea. So we did some very simple calculations to understand the impact of internal occupation, of internal gains, activities in the building. These people live in density and compactness. And in fact, we saw if outside is 27, inside we can get over 30 degrees easily, 32, 33. What is the mistake here? Ventilation is not working. The moment we increase the aperture to the point that we have half of the wall, now we are looking at a room which is not at the roof, otherwise the roof will be the main dominant factor here. But if we just want to study the effect of ventilation and windows in a community like that, and if we imagine the whole front wall can be permeable, like this image on the bottom right, we can have a reduction of almost 3 degrees Celsius. So ventilation works. How to design that? So working with elements that they have on site and that they built their homes. What if we start looking at the brick, which has the hand size? It's the easiest material to manipulate, to create different interfaces with the outside. From that point, we look at the facade, and we also look at the roof now. Going back to the idea of transitional spaces, of ambiguous spaces, maybe it's not about being outdoor or indoor, but having enough shelter so the conditions are healthy and the space is a nice sensorial experience. And when we look again at the slum and the level of density, the rooftop is absolutely prime space. That's where we have the sky, we are exposed to wind, We can control the radiation if we design for that. And we have open space. And they do use the rooftop as an extension of the internal spaces, because there are moments that it's just impossible to be inside any room. So being outside is the place to be. So we go back to look at the climate. We know ventilation works. We know we want permeability, but we also know we want to leave the sun out, especially in the summer. So designing for different orientations, just building on that one element, the brick, and start building screens using its dimensions to create a proper protection. And in that way, we consider environmental design as an open project, meaning we don't do it, they do it. And that's another strong point I would like to share. This is when we're going to start seriously having an impact. So we create a simple matrix on how to use the brick to have the right shades depending on the orientation, if your facade is completely exposed, or if you are designing at rooftop. Mude means change in Portuguese. And then you also demonstrate. We take a rooftop of a house and we see, we apply, we design, and we show how this could look like. And then we envision a transformation of the rooftops where every home would have this ambiguous space with the right shelter. So the outdoor space is the space to be now. I'm going to come back to that project because this became a real project in a minute. We also went down to the ground to look at how does the dynamics of that thriving built environment affect the urban environment, the spaces where people circulate, where they meet, where the markets happen, where the shops are. And we saw that entering the slum, where there's a concentration of inert materials and absolutely no shade and no green, surface temperatures can be up to 48 degrees. Just follow the blue line. The yellow line, 45.7 degrees. As we go down to the alleys, as we go into that very intricate urban fabric, surface temperatures can go down to 26 degrees, 20 degrees difference. So much nicer to open a window to that than open a window to the main road. And air temperatures will also respond to that, and humidity and air movement. We capture that in images to see how people adapt and how do they cope in these situations, to learn something also from their experience. And we start seeing the difference. São Paulo has just gone through a series of heat waves where the conditions in those homes and in the informal cities that tend to be warmer than the legalized, the planned city, it's much worse in the informal city. And it hit the news. So a few weeks ago, Paraisópolis is 9 degrees warmer than Morumbi, which is the neighborhood, the former neighborhood of high-rises and green buildings on the side. It's actually much more than 9 degrees. At surface level, it's 20 degrees. At temperature level, maybe 9 or 8. But what they were measuring here is just the rooftop temperatures. So it's worse than what they think. And what we did with that project, the Everyday House, the university financed a construction of an installation which became a real extension of the rooftop of the association, community association building, where people get together to discuss their issues. And then maybe learn about creating these screens based on design. Another important point for me, design is important. There's a lot in vernacular, there's a lot in local knowledge in these communities. You go there, it's a pot of creativity and invention, but we have a great contribution to do by designing, by giving precision, as a framework, as an open project, more than giving a final building. Now, participatory processes and knowledge transfer, for me, is everything when we talk about this topic. Again, if we want to have an impact. And the second experience we had also with favelas, following the Everyday House, was a workshop supported by the UN Habitat Program in 2020, where we created a program, TV program, a YouTube program, where we organize ourselves, a team of environmental designers, that basically what we did in this workshop was to analyze a series of photos that were sent during this hour to us online, and observing these photographs, what works and what doesn't work, done by the people. This is self-built. All this world is self-built. That's what is also amazing about that, without design. So we had that little experience about the Everyday House, but what if we now want to talk directly to people? So we created that. It was a day, an afternoon, very busy, receiving all those photos, analyzing them and posting them and discussing them with people that came live on the chat. And we first appreciate, we have to be polite, and we have to support these people. So what is it that works there as an initial idea? Lots of screens, ceramic bricks being used as a way of keeping spaces permanently ventilated, rooftops shaded, but also lack of plaster, lack of protection of those walls that make them very exposed to solar radiation, both the roof and the walls. So we listed all of that. We had less than 10 minutes to analyze those photos, and we posted 55 photos with suggestions also. If you have the money to improve your home, here's the photo, this is what works, go here and do that. That will be the most effective way of improving, of making your space healthier and more pleasant. Then we went to Rio in the second project. This is a PhD thesis that just finished, and did a similar process in Islam, which has one of the most beautiful views in the city. These people live well in a way. They see the Guanabara Bay, the Cristo, and the beach. But they do suffer when it comes to their conditions indoors. And we saw, again, the same problems, small windows, the brick without any kind of insulation or reflection to the sun, rooftops not always well shaded, and a compact form that it's really detrimental to ventilation. We went inside to take measurements, and we found spaces with 38 degrees when outside was 28. And that's because of sun coming from the roof, coming from the wall, and windows closed. Now, as we open windows on rooms, in other rooms, we found a decrease to 34 degrees, still much higher than the outside. And this has to do with the activities indoors, with the compactness of the shape, and with the small windows. Then we conducted a wide range of analytical work, and I'm not going to bother you with all of that. This is all published anyway for those who want to see this work. It's in papers now. We found a reduction from 42 to 32 degrees inside as we increase opening, and we protect the walls from the outside. External render, external plaster, a simple act that makes 3, 4, 5 degrees difference in those homes. The point is that, I'll comment on this graph in a minute, the point is when you have a bit of money and you want to improve your home, you're not going to go put the plaster outside. You want to put the plaster inside because you want your living room, your bedroom to look nice. And you're right, or they are right. So we need public policies to work together with these communities to then get to the level that we want in terms of responses. And here we see just testing all those scenarios that you saw in the table before, now looking throughout the day, because we are not only interested in peak temperatures, we are very interested in night temperatures, when these people are going to bed, when they sleep. Maybe 32 is good during the day if the air is moving, but it's not good to sleep. It's not healthy. You can't sleep. So we need temperatures below 28, 27, 26. What can we achieve? And we can almost get there. We can reduce thermal stress, but we need more air movement. And that's also where physics is helping us. And here is another unlock moment for innovation, that just by opening windows in that level of compactness, we were not going to achieve that. We need to introduce ventilation chimneys an element that we are now designing and see how can this become a market device that they can come and install on their steps, access to the rooftop, and then improve this ventilation. There are initiatives that improve the conditions, as we see in other cities in Brazil, dealing with shading, dealing with bigger apertures. But if we look at what the analytical work was telling us, the external plaster is important, ventilation chimneys will be necessary. These are wonderful images, but in a future or in a situation of extreme heat, is not yet good enough. So we need to come and transfer that knowledge. I'm concluding. Another way, because we became so interested in this knowledge transfer and designing with the residents, or even maybe engaging them in buildability of the solutions, we started this project called Environmentalize, or Ambientalize in Portuguese. 25 design projects where we are looking at how architects from the tropical zone have engaged communities in the design process to understand their likes. Otherwise, the self-built is not going to be what should be to be better. If we don't understand what these people want, what do you want in your home? Not them, any of us. So we look into how participatory processes have been conducted, various types, in various ways. And Entre Nos Atelier is a practice from San Jose in Costa Rica. It's an ex-AA guy, Michael Smith, one of the directors of the office that works with communities, building buildings without windows, without glass, with local materials, very right to the climate, engaging the community, and even in his process of participation is also to assist them in envision what their buildings will be. And in that process, they become, they own the project as well. We go to another part of the world, the Gazanzi Primary School by Asa Studio in Kigali, in Rwanda, where we see mass, insulation, ventilation with design. And again, here the people are involved also in the construction process, not so much in the design. So we are learning about, by documenting these projects, we want to systematize all these processes. Just a parenthesis, because I can't help not to be a teacher. Mass works in the tropics, and mass is going to help us in the future of climate change, because more than insulation that blocks the temperatures or the heat flow, the mass will create that delta T that we want. So if temperature is 34, 35, 36, that could help in the tropics, it could happen. The shade and the ventilation, it's good, but we need more resistance, and we need the lag, we need that absorption of heat. And this is what we see here. A savanna climate, humid and dry. So this general idea that the tropicals is only about shade and ventilation is not enough in some places. This is why climate analysis is so important. We want to be technical about this. We want to understand the physics. Now, this is the last project I want to briefly mention. It's not a project that, it's just a proposal that Weinstock was mentioning in the beginning. Just as Climate Week started, I got this wonderful news that the data-driven redesign for urban climate adaptation in Brazilian informal settlements have been approved by a UK founder that I cannot reveal the name until we sign the contract. But it's a 3-year project that's going to look at informal settlement just at the border with the University of São Paulo, and with all the knowledge that we have accumulated from the experience in Paraisópolis, the experience in Rio, the UN Habitat workshop, the environmentalized documentation of participatory processes. We're going to bring all of this together to try to answer these 2 questions. What knowledge to transfer and how to transfer, to then have an impact in the life of these people. So the aim, the first, let's say the academic, our aim is to increase the capacity of the favela residents to adapt their homes to cope with climate change. That's what we want to do. And we're going to do this in 3 ways. We first collect data, all sorts of data, real-life data, to understand the complexity and also the vulnerability of the self-built homes. And where does it lie? Is it in the external plaster? Is it in the ventilation? We need to increase, we need chimneys now, an element that is inexistent in the tropical favela. What can we do with the rooftops to create great gathering spaces? But we need to understand the existing fabric. And then we design adaptation measures with them. What do they like? How do they understand their role? What elements do they recognize as their own elements of their built environment as well? And then we model, we analyze, we optimize, we make it adequate, and we offer this wide menu of solutions, hopefully. The pilot project is directly related to a slum in São Paulo, but hopefully we're going to have results that we can apply to the rest of the country and the region, with variations, of course. It's an open project. Now, I want to end reading this paragraph to you, because I read this a few years ago, and I think it's so encouraging. Sustainable development also needs idealism. It needs people who can show where it is we might be going, who can create experiments and pilot projects, sometimes on a small and sometimes on a large scale, which will overcome people's fear of the unknown and which will enable them to loosen their hold on the habits of a lifetime, of a generation, and indeed the habits of the Industrial Revolution as a whole. That will give them the confidence to look forward to a millennium, which we can be certain will be a millennium. It is already, of ecological scarcity and much poverty. Much of the planet is already populated, and towards the middle of the 21st century, there will be 10 billion people, 9, 10, a big number, whom that planet is expected to sustain. It is only conceivable that we can do that if we utilize both our vision and our pragmatism. Thank you very much.
Time for a few questions. If anyone would like to.
Not a difficult one,
Thank you, Joana. It was a great presentation. A part of the lecture that struck me the most is when he said we need to open up more rather than closing down, which is very interesting if we look at it from the other end of the spectrum, who's the society, us living. And by doing this, I just want to have your expert opinion about, so man, if we think of being more exposed to these changes, so practically we are trying to activate the spaces that were necessarily left abandoned in the cities, like spaces in between. And how do you imagine this would impact not only at the scale of the built environment, but the scale of way of living, experiencing in these way of opening up? Thank you.
Thank you, Milad. Great question. Well, first, I mean, it will be a rediscovery. I can definitely see from the experience of existing buildings in the Brazilian modernism, like the MESP building in Rio, that has a green terrace attached to the first floor, how the moment you go out in a break, and it's well landscaped, and it's warm, but it's not so hot, and you are in the shade. You come back in, you switch off your air condition. You don't need it. So I think by creating these transitions, we're gonna rediscover climate and experiences and sensorial experiences that will give us a completely different understanding of what we want inside. But I think in addition to that, if I go back to a very basic principle, we are outdoor animals. We have been for millennia. We've been in buildings for a very short time when we look at the history of the human body. So I think it's almost going back to our natural habitat and hopefully be happier people, socialize much more, exchange more ideas, look more at each other. And I think find some peace with the climate change. I think that's the hope there, I see. I don't know if I answer your question.
Thank you.
Anyone else like to ask a question?
Not really a question, but I wanted just to share something which is a poignant point on the very last slide. Some of you know me, some of you don't know me. I'm actually not an architect. I'm an environmental engineer, building physicist. And you were saying a lot about the principles of physics and understanding that, which I fully support. The one piece that we miss a lot is culture. Okay? How culture varies in different parts of the world. You touched on it. We talk about climate, we talk about context. And the older I'm getting, the more I start to understand this third piece, or the third C, as I call it. Culture is so important. You spoke about being on the outside. We almost don't design enough about the outside. You go from open straight into enclosed spaces, and transition spaces already start between the outside and the inside. And when you look at a lot of different cultures, let's take your particular zone, the tropics, it is a huge way of their life, of living. They often cook on the outside with the community. The spaces which they use that are inside is generally for sleeping, not communal activities. And we have this westernized view of, no, you have a dining room and this and that. And we sell this to a lot of cultures as being the way of living as opposed to the other way around. So what I'm learning and what I think one should also share in the school is we need to also challenge not just how we design buildings in terms of the building physics performance, but their functionality and relative to different cultures. And with that, I just want, because I think it's a statistical point which is super important, which I have to confess, we only stumbled across, but it sent a little shockwave on a real-life project in Luanda, in Angola, participating with a well-known architect to an extremely large urban development, almost 100,000 people living in this. And it was very much, yes, all of the usual environmental approach, etc., and what the government wanted. And then we said, so who are the people going to live here? Well, it's the workers and investors and etc. And then the penny dropped. 75% of Angola's population is under 25. That is over 40% of the entire UK population is under 25, student age. So, if that and is known is in one country, many of the sub-Saharan countries have this very high level of young population. The health system gets them living longer, no outlook. Who asks them what they want for their future? And even the government ministers who were there at the meeting went quiet because we're not designing for them. So, coming back, I just wanted to share that because this is just one example of many in these countries, and everybody hears about migration, everybody hears about everything else that we don't like to talk about. But we need to help these people in their country. And for me, that requires an understanding of culture as much as of building physics. So I just wanted to throw that in the mix.
Some clients, science researchers that are studying climate change now, and I'm sure Mike Weinstock is familiar with that information, says if we get Africa wrong, that's it. We can do anything we want in Europe as well as we can do with environmental design. The future of the planet relies on how well Africa and the developing world will evolve and urbanize.
We have time for one more question.
Mania.
Yes, sorry, maybe just one comment on that last part, because actually you're saying you want to give agency, right? I think so that's it. So it doesn't matter if it is for the people that live there now or the younger generation. So I think your mission of deciding which knowledge to transfer and how to do it, I think is very important. But also I'm just wondering, what you said about like kind of culture, like should we still sleep on the second floor or should you sleep somewhere else, or I don't know, what are the added kind of opportunities that are not just, let's say, making openings or changing the facade or changing the roof, like really about the way of living or clustering. It's not anymore individual. So where do you see these opportunities?
To give a short answer, Mana, thank you. That's a very good point. I think by the first part of the project, which is understanding the existing conditions, not just the temperatures, but maybe opening up the existing conditions, will tell us the opportunities. And what you're just mentioning, sleeping at the roof or using the roof, is already happening in all of them. I mean, it's escape almost, but it's still not as good as it could be if there was some design assistance. If we are very open in the framework and also in offering the solutions, we're going to accommodate all these opportunities. And I look at the roof with a great potential because we're not going to erase those. We are not modernists. We're not going to erase anything. It's there, and there is a new floor. And I think if I want to talk technically, it's definitely the roofscape.
Okay, thank you for, okay, one last one.
Really short, Sir Wilson.
And then you get to do the thank you for Joana.
I'm so cheeky to grab the mic, but massive thank you to Joana. That was really amazing. And I just wanted to kind of explode open what you're saying, which is so important about the tropics, to ask and suggest if the same approach can't be applied worldwide, because what you're talking about is using existing building fabric, and as you exactly just said, not erasing and starting fresh, but working with what we already have. And this approach, which is community first, designed from the ground up, it's what we have to do in the UK with retrofit, but it's a very different design puzzle, but it's exactly the same approach. So is this not a global solution that you're offering, as well as one that's very tropical centric?
I would call it, that's the environmental design approach. And that's where we're different from all the modernist legacy. We don't come with final buildings, or we shouldn't. Thank you. Thank you.